Hello, I'm Harry Cole, Sun's political editor, and in my column this week, I've had a look at what really is going on under the bonnet in the British state. We saw the budget on Wednesday that was a fairly low-key affair on the scale of previous budgets that we got used to. There's not really any money left. When Labour left power in 2010, they actually wrote that down in a note and left it in the Treasury drawer saying, "Dear Chancellor, there is no money left." No one's going to be stupid enough to admit that again publicly, but Jeremy Hunt's speech on Wednesday was essentially just a very long-winded, hour-long version of saying just that. So I've had a look at what's really going to be in the in tray from hell for the Labour Party. The IFS, the independent think tank, say that actually, realistically, the government spending plans that Labour have signed up to mean back to austerity. They're actually, in reality, spending cuts because the way that the NHS is protected, education is protected. Lots of cuts will have to come from other things like prisons and courts, which are already pretty thin to the bone. And then also we've got this great problem of defence spending. A new incoming Labour government will be taken to a side very quietly on day one and told exactly how bad the state of Britain's armed services, everything from our lack of missiles and ammunition because we've given it all to Ukraine, to the creaking, aging state of our nuclear arsenal. Now, a new prime minister, or the next government, whoever it is going to be, is going to have to dramatically hike defence spending. So that's another 15, perhaps 20 billion pounds that needs to be found by the new government. Then, of course, we've got the infected blood scandal, the most outrageous thing in the NHS's history. Thousands and thousands of people are killed by that. Lots of compensation coming down the line. Some people, and they're being sort of, on the low estimates, think it could be 15 to 20 billion pounds. Again, will need to be found in the coming months. So all of that's sort of mounting up. And actually, I'm just had a look in the column about whether Labour really have know what they're getting into, and really whether they'll actually be able to do any of the things they want, plus all the things they need to do without massively increasing borrowing or, shock horror, putting up taxes.
And Labour are, of course, a party that likes to spend big and has bold and big plans. But the reality is, where is the money going to come from?
Well, that's the thing. The government have their fiscal rules that debt will have to be falling within 5 years as a proportion of GDP. Labour have a similar sort of tram lines for there to try to convince people that they're not big spenders. Reality based, just looking at it, something's got to give there. Either they'll have to be more borrowing. Labour insist they won't do that, only for investment. Or there's going to have to be tax cuts. So tax rises, sorry. So enjoy your national insurance cut while it lasts.
Of course, we don't. No one has a crystal ball, and no one knows exactly what's going to happen. And the political landscape can change very quickly. There seems to be some positive sentiment off the back of the budget, particularly with regard to childcare. Are there still wins to be had for the Conservatives and time to make up some ground?
Well, that's what they're desperately be hoping. They're trying to do. Their government is saying, don't look at this budget on its own. Look at it in conjunction with the autumn statement for November. Add up all the tax cuts there and all the childcare offerings and all the benefits changes, and actually look at it in the round. But the problem is that they cut a lot of tax in 2p off of national insurance in November. It didn't move the dial. If anything, the polls have got worse since then. There's no reason. There's no obvious. We'll have to wait and see. But there's no obvious reason that it's going to work a second time any more than it will work the first time. Tories are 20 points behind in the polls. They're getting a little bit jaded. In fact, ministers are openly talking about life in opposition. The problem is Labour are still actually quite untested. And with a little bit of scrutiny, they tend to actually wobble a little bit. And we've seen that a little bit with the fact that Jeremy Hunt, in a sort of nakedly political act, stole their non-dom policy. And obviously they'd already spent that money. They'd already committed that money on things like childcare, child meals, and on the NHS. So they're gonna have to find that money, but they don't seem to have many answers. Rachel Reeves just said today that, well, we'll just find the money. Well, the question is, it's going to be where. So I think the Tories will go long in their campaign. I think they think that the Labour leader and his shadow chancellor are vulnerable to scrutiny, as we saw on their U-turn on the 28 billion on their green investment. They think that actually, if they can punch the bruise, they might be able to tighten those polls. But what it fundamentally comes down to is, are the British public just, sick of the Tories? They want, they want a change of government. There's that feeling of change. Will that trump all other policy options and giveaway options that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister can do? Current state of the polls would imply that they're swimming against the tide.
There are some concerns, though, for Keir Starmer, as you mentioned, that £28 billion UTIN, but maybe more of an issue for him is his backing for Israel and its military operation in Gaza to date, and the pressure on him from parts of his party to move away from that and to call for a permanent ceasefire. His language has changed slightly over the last few weeks. But what kind of pressure do you think there is there, and how much of a problem is that for Keir Starmer and the remaining hard left of his party?
But I think if Keir Starmer was to just scrape home at the election, I think he'd be in a trickier position. Don't forget, he needs 128 gains just to have a majority of one. Now, where he had a majority of 15 to 20, perhaps, then that would give the hard left of his party a much bigger say in how things go. It's actually the worst case scenario for Starmer would be to be in the hock to the left, to be reliant on, the Jeremy Corbyns, the Diane Abbotts, the John McDonnells of this world, to get every single vote through, because that will suddenly give the left of the party, which is still it's a small rump and it has been massively reduced by Starmer over the last couple of years. It would give them an unprecedented amount of sway over the government. So it's all very well for Keir Starmer to say, I've changed my party, I've changed, the leadership has changed. Yeah, I think you can give him credit for some of that. But actually, would his party have really changed if the same people who got them into this mess were somehow then pulling the strings? And on Gaza, you're really seeing that come to bear. Currently, Keir Starmer doesn't have enough MPs to even staff his front bench. You've got people double jobbing. You've got MPs who've won by-elections in recent months suddenly already taking up shadow positions because so many of his benches have quit over Gaza that every time that there's going to be another vote, he risks losing more people. Hence why he was so keen to make that Gaza ceasefire vote go his way, even bending the rules of Parliament to stop the SNP mischief making and sort of exposing the splits in the Labour Party. What Keir Starmer does have on his side, though, is Joe Biden currently, and the way that the Democrats and the White House are moving towards a more permanent ceasefire, putting a lot of pressure on Israel just to be a little bit more proportionate. They say in their response in their actions in Gaza. That gives Starmer a lot of cover to be able to sort of move his position broadly to where more of his party is. The softer the Americans go, the easier it is for Starmer to just say, look, well, we're in lockstep with our allies. He gets to kind of pretend to be prime ministerial and doing everything in consultation with the United States, but politically, it's also making life a lot easier for him.
A lot of the debate on social media would have you believe that there's kind of a done deal in terms of where the next election result is going. But you could have said the same thing about Trump, about Brexit, about the polls for independence in Scotland, etc. And yet the result often becomes something of a surprise, and polls do change. What do you think would be the impact of Rishi Sunak's speech the other day outside Downing Street, in which he kind of called out those protests that we've been seeing every week, and said that he's spoken to the police and they're expecting a tougher line.
Yeah, that Friday night 5:45 speech to the nation on the steps of Downing Street probably didn't, have a huge amount of cut through, but I think the Prime Minister wanted to get a few things off his chest and did it. You're right, polls change. They do. Look at Theresa May in 2017. She was heading into that election, looking at a ginormous majority, and she ended up with a hung parliament. These things can turn on a bad campaign, especially if a campaign is made sort of presidential and the candidate doesn't sort of live up to that scrutiny. So yes, obviously there are chances that things could move. However, I think the scale and consistency of the polls, which are all basically sort of clustering around a 20-point Labour lead. Some of them are a little bit lower, perhaps 14 points. But the polls would have to be spectacularly wrong this time. But I do think a hung parliament is underpriced. As I said, 128 seats for a gain of one. That's bigger than Tony Blair's swing. That's bigger than David Cameron achieved in 2010. It has to make some serious, serious gains. The most pessimistic person I've spoken to about Labour's chances of winning the next election is Keir Starmer, But yet you'd think when you were watching them, during the budget, heckling and shouting, screaming at Jeremy Hunt, get out the way, it's our turn, let us in to fix it. Labour MPs think it's a done deal, but the leadership are desperately trying to keep that complacency at bay because they know how big the scale of the task is, and deep down they know that Keir Starmer's no Tony Blair, and also they will be watching the same focus groups and polling that we see that show he hasn't yet convinced the public. He's got a long way to go to sort of win people over, and at the moment he's on course to win by simply not being the Tories. And you think any prime minister, any politician would want to have a little bit more of a backing and a mandate from the people than simply not being the other guy.
Well, whoever gets in, there's no money to do anything, but at least the price of a pint stays roughly the same for now.
Exactly. Good news for drinkers and drivers, bad news for smokers and pretty much everyone else.